Well, we'd like to welcome all of you today to another BYU Library Family History Center presentation. Today's class is update of the Ultimate Digital Preservation Guide, which was a video presentation that I did many years ago. It was about time to be updated since many, many, many things have changed over that time period. When we start thinking about preservation, it usually starts with a box of old records or photos. It may be just a very few items up to many items, and in some cases, for people such as genealogists who have been doing their work for a very long time, like me, for example, the collections can be going into many, 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 many boxes of old records and letters and photos and documents and all sorts of things. So there comes a time when we look at the pile or look at the few things we have or whatever, and we want to know what are we going to do with this? And why would we do anything with it, perhaps, is another question. And it's pretty obvious that the scope of the preservation project depends entirely on the number of items to be preserved. If we're talking about under 100 items, then in a sense, that may take a couple of hours of work, or maybe 2 or 3 hour, 4 hours of work using a scanner or perhaps some other device. And that would be about it. Of course, the ultimate question is where do these things go? And the answer to that, we encourage people to put them up online. And of course, since we're affiliated with Family Search, we would urge people to use the free Family Search program for the memory section to upload their documents and photographs and records. The first issue here that we get to, because we do have, it's something, in some cases, we have paper. In other cases, we have photographs or we have slides or we have videos or 8 millimeter movies, any kind of document that may exist. And as I go further on in this discussion, you'll find out that the BYU Library Family History Center has a huge variety of digitizing equipment that can be used for many, many, many media, all of the things I've mentioned and more. But initially, the question is the preservation of the original items, the original documents and photographs and other items. In this case, we're looking at an old family group record. This record looks like it was made back in 1960. The question then arises with regards to physical preservation, is this a document that needs to be physically preserved? Well, the answer to that is real simple, no, because this is not an original document pertaining to an original source. The information on this document is valuable, but because this is a document and because this was submitted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it is basically recorded and the information has been preserved. You can go on to familysearch.org and look at the Family Search family tree and look for these individuals and verify that this information has been added to the Family Search family tree. But the chances are very good that an older family group record like this would have already been entered into the family tree many times, perhaps. Perhaps there is even duplicates because of the variety of original of these kinds of documents. When you're looking at a document, you have to ask yourself some important questions. The first one is apart from the information in the records. Okay, we're going to think in this kind of an abstract concept. The records contain information. Historical records contain information. And so when you're looking at the document, what's there, what you can read, or perhaps if it's in another language, what you can't read, has some information that should be preserved. The question, of course, is that information already been preserved in digital format and sitting out on a website? On Family Search or Ancestry or Find My Past or My Heritage or any number of other American ancestors goes on, the list goes on, or Special Collections Library or any other online organization that perhaps has preserved the digital record. A good example with photographs. I inherited a huge collection of photographs from my great-grandmother, who was a professional photographer for many years. Those records were scanned by me, so they're preserved digitally. Many of those photographs have gone on to Family Search in the memory section, and all of those documents were provided, and the digital copies, to the University of Arizona's photographic collection down in Tucson, Arizona. The questions are, is there some intrinsic value in the document itself, or is the document merely transmitting information? And let me give you a contrasting, and I will in just a moment, but just here to get this explained. The contrasting information is like a letter, a handwritten letter from an ancestor. That is an original document. That pertains to that person, and it has intrinsic value. So their simple answer to that question is yes. But in other cases, like the one I just mentioned about the family group record, is only if you find that the information has not been preserved, that then you copy the information off the paper, and the paper is no longer a valuable document. Here's the real question. Are you willing to spend some time, effort, and perhaps money preserving the records? And that is something that I can't answer for you. You have to answer for yourself. In my case, we've spent a considerable amount of time, effort, and money preserving our records. And that's just because we value those records and we have shared those records in ways that they can be used by others now as they are digitized and made available. And here's the other question. Is there anyone else in your family who would want to preserve the records? So for whatever reason, I have been that person, and I have received literally boxes and boxes of records from various relatives over the years. And that's one of the reasons why what I currently have in a lot of information stored is because of my family and because they wanted me to be the person that was the person that was going to preserve the records. Next, if you decide to preserve the records, how will you do that? Okay, so that's why I'm here today, to kind of give you an idea or insight into the different options that you have when you're going out to preserve records. Now we have to kind of think about this whole process and get into the concept of what is involved in record preservation. This is something that goes on at a national, international level. And there's institutions all over the world today that are preserving records. And one option, of course, for preserving physical records, if they do have intrinsic value, is to see whether or not there is an institution who wants to house or receive those documents, and then the process of preservation would be transferred from you to the institution. These take the form of museums, archives, special collections, libraries for the universities, and other specialized record preservation areas. It's a very complex and very, very extensive pattern of this record preservation across the world. Some countries do not have a high level of awareness of the need to preserve records, and therefore their record sets are not as complete and not as useful as others for genealogical purposes. But in many countries, there have been tremendous efforts to preserve and make available the records. For example, a country like England. England has 48 counties, more or less, depending on the way you count them and what year you count them in. And that's kind of a side comment on English research. But of the counties in England today, which are called districts, the districts, almost every single one, I believe every one, has a dedicated family history area in their county. They either have an archive building, they have museums, so they have libraries, or they have their own collections online for every county in England. Now, you can't say that, certainly cannot say that about the United States. The United States has like more than 3,000 counties, and some have county museums and county historical societies and county genealogical societies, but as official county records, those are usually courthouses and other buildings. And as we are aware, if we do research, you find out, like with this fire burning here, those records can be, despite the best efforts, can decay or be destroyed or lost in many, many, many different ways. Floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes. Records are lost all the time. It's just sort of a constant problem. And as genealogists, we don't sit there and obsess about it, only a little bit, but we are concerned. And when we see that records that are not being preserved, and that really involves some physical effort on us. Many years ago, for personal reasons in a family matter, we were at the Mesa City Cemetery, and I observed that there were some old books and things in the small cemetery office that looked rather old. And after an inquiry to find out about those records, found that they had not been digitized. And that started a 2 year, 3 year process that I was involved in digitizing all those records for Family Search. This is a good example. We often think about the example of the 1890 US Census that was supposedly burned. That's the common thing that you'll find mentioned everywhere. The reality of that was that only a portion of the census was burned, and then it was simply left in the storage area, wherever it was. And years later, the Library of Congress failed to appropriate any funds to preserve the census, and it was thrown away, destroyed. So it was not necessarily an issue of fire, but an issue of government neglect. And this was not government neglect. This was an actual fire. And that was the National Personnel Records Center in 1973. This is from the National Archives website. These are the ones that were affected. That means they're gone. Discharged between November 1st, 1912 to 1960. And then personal discharge September 25th, 1947 to January 1st, 1964. That got pretty close to me, but it takes in both my father and my grandfather. So this was a very challenging thing, because now, as you try to do records on the personnel records for that huge group of military veterans in the Army and the Air Force, then it really makes finding those people very much more difficult. There are more records. The information was not completely lost, but it has to be reconstructed from a variety of other documents. It's just important. This is a side note, and the side note is that about roughly today in this 2024, but 2025 is going to have a little more than that. Roughly 70 million people die worldwide. So what happens? Basically, due to a whole number of factors, depending on the place where the person dies and the circumstances of their death, and simply because deaths aren't recorded by the place where the person dies, many of those people who die every year will just disappear from the records that do manage to be preserved. And if you project this particular issue back into the past, let's say go back 100 years or 200 years, the percentage of the disappearance grows. So it's entirely, I know this is just absolutely frustrating to genealogists because I get the question regularly. But the question is, yes, eventually you're going to go back and there will be no more records about this particular person or this particular family line. It just ends. And no amount of research is going to reconstruct or find where this person lived. And I guess the difference between a casual genealogist and a dedicated genealogist with a lot of research background is that the amount of effort that can be put in before you get to that point differs greatly. And in some cases, no matter how much research experience you have, and no matter how well you can do research, and no matter how many records you know and how many records you look at, you will simply not find those people. That's kind of the reality here. As genealogists, we would like to minimize the impact of that by preserving as many of the basic records as we can and making them available and making them accessible to researchers and people who are looking to find their families. So we focus primarily, and I say we in the context of the genealogical community, focus on information, but not necessarily so much on the paper. In today's world, for many, many reasons, I am to the point where I simply tell people when they start to hand me something on paper that I don't really need on paper, I just need the information. I say I don't do paper. I have enough paper piled around, and I just don't need to continue to add to that pile. Whereas I am constantly processing information, both from paper and from digital records in doing research for myself and helping others do their research, showing them where the records are and how to find the information. So the ultimate question I get when I get into a discussion with someone about this subject of preservation is, do we keep the paper once there's a digital copy? Now we're going to go back to the first few slides, and that is, yes, we do keep the paper if there is an intrinsic historical value about the paper itself. But that's a judgment call. And that's up to basically in the case of archives and libraries, that's based on their interests and what they will preserve. Frequently, someone will come to me and say, well, I have all these documents from my grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, all the different people. In other words, we've got a bunch of paper. So what do I do with it? Well, I said, we digitize it. What do we do with the digital copies? We put them online, preferably on a website that's free like Family Search, but on any of the other websites, that's also a good idea. So then what? And my answer is, then what? And then I questioned, oh, can I give these to a family history center? Well, it'd be a family search center now, to a family search center. And I say, no, they don't store documents. They don't have any facilities for taking your documents and doing anything. Well, what if I go to family search? Will they take the documents? Not likely. They will ensure that there are digital copies, but they have a large number of books. They have a large number of documents, original documents, and they store them in a large vault called the Granite Vault, drilled into solid granite up a canyon by Salt Lake City called Little Cottonwood Canyon. But they're not really in the process of taking people's collections of genealogy records. And if you look at the genealogy record collections, it's often that the vast majority of those records, documents, end up being of the category of a family group sheet that I showed initially. In other words, we'd like the information. We want to make sure the information is preserved, and we'll put it online in maybe one or two or three or four different websites so that we know that that information is available to family members, but we're not concerned about the paper. And so in my case, for example, after processing a 3 foot high pile of family group records from the Family History Library, which is now the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City, over the years that went where I would throw old paper away. And so basically, there's no reason. And on the other hand, if like I say, if there's an intrinsic value to it, then maybe you can find it. Now, if you're, this will depend on the circumstances and the actual historical value of the information that you're presenting. If it's something that fills somebody's need at a special collections library or an archive, they will grab that as fast as you offer it, and they'll be just glad to get it. On the other hand, if it's in that category of records that are nothing more than information, then they will probably say we're not interested at all. So that's kind of the way that it works when you're dealing with this ultimate question. But I need to say that these original personal records, where they were written by an individual, handwritten on a piece of paper, are extremely scarce and are valuable. In fact, if you get back in time, and it depends on the person, it depends on the circumstances, you could get letters from the Civil War people, for instance, the soldiers, million people that were involved in the Civil War or more. Civil War letters have a value. They have a cash value. They have a value that people will buy and sell the letters. And there are other types of categories of those items that have a valuable intrinsic value. A letter from 1992 from somebody does not really have that kind of intrinsic value, but it still has a family and historical intrinsic value. And yes, I would encourage people to maintain and preserve those letters as best they can. But you get back to the same question when I come back to the family group record, and that is how much of the content or information is already digitized and online. If I can get onto Family Search or any one of the other big websites that I've mentioned and find that person and find everything that's on this family group record in a matter of a few minutes, there's no reason in the world for me to keep this. This isn't to add anything. It's been typewritten. It doesn't have any intrinsic value in that sense, but there may be records and information on it that have not been added. I might mention that Family Search has millions of records set of family group records that they had gathered over 100 years, more or less, that is all digitized and on the FamilySearch.org website in the genealogies section. So if you go to FamilySearch.org, go to the catalog, and you put in family group records or family group, you'll find this huge collection of records that have been indexed completely. You can search for them and everything. So if you wonder if this old family group record you have is available, you can just go to Family Search and search for it on this in the search tab. I forget about genealogies. That was another type of record. That's in the ancestral file, which is the compilation of all of those records. So that's not the actual digital copies of them, like the ones that are in the search in the historical record collection. Okay. One thing that's tremendously important to understand is the cost of preservation and storage increases over time. So the longer the document exists, the harder it is to preserve it and the longer it takes to preserve it. And what we have here is a record from the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis, Maryland. And my wife and I, back a few years ago, were church service missionaries for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, working with Family Search to digitize these records, along with some other missionary couples. Our job essentially was to process these documents that were sitting in the Maryland State Archives. And you can see that despite the efforts anyone in the past may have made, they were unsuccessful in preserving some of the information on this particular page. You might say, well, how could we go ahead and digitize these records if they look like this? Weren't we afraid we were going to die? The answer is, well, we were cautious, but these had to go through a process at the archives to freeze the document in a sense, and then make it so that all of the stuff on there was inert. So this is just the rests of what's left of the mold, not the actual mold, hopefully. So this, in fact, is the digitization point setup that we had for digitizing the documents. The documents came in from the right and went over to the left, and there was a box to put them in. When we were doing books, we were taking them on and off of the little push around carts that they have in libraries and archives and going through the digitization process with the records being taken by the camera that was up there. Originally, they used very expensive commercial cameras. As technology changed, then they began to use standard cameras, and pretty soon this one was a Nikon camera. So now the actual finding physical items to do your digitization is right now as simple as your smartphone. So if you're carrying around a smartphone and you have a camera in it, you have the way to start digitizing your documents. So that's the simple matter of what's happening today. If you're wondering about how all the different types of items can be preserved, then you can go to the Library of Congress. That's loc.gov, G-O-V, and look for preservation. Do a quick search in the search tab for preservation. You'll get the Library of Congress Preservation Directorate, and this is the place where you would go to get all the instruction about handling various difficult tasks in conservation, preservation, and also in every different category. I mean, everything. And by the way, it's from cloth to comic books. And there's anything you can probably think of, art, antiques, furniture, anything. There are all the connections here that tell the official way that those particular items should be conserved. And the way that they basically look at documents is through digital preservation. And so that's the, you're not going, there's no longer discussion about that. It's just take digital images. There's some guidelines here about the resolution and all of the different kinds of things. Basically, depending on the way you're going to get into each type of resolution of preservation resolution, and that is something that is unfortunately beyond the scope of this particular presentation. But just being aware that it's there and here's where it is. So they will ultimately tell you the recommended resolution and file format, JPEG or TIFF or PDF or whatever. So this is where you get that information and the answers to those. Now, what about you want to digitize and store on your own computer or your own system of doing record sets? Now, I would recommend this. In other words, before I did it, tried to give it to anybody or put it up online, I'd make sure I had everything on my computer and on my hard drives. Now, over the years, this is where there's been the most dramatic change in the process of digitization. Starting many, many years ago, when we were using primarily Apple Macintosh based over the years, but I've been using PCs constantly for the same period of time. And that is whether it's a PC or a Mac, the issue was file storage. And back 10, 15, 20 years ago, beginning going back that way, it turned out that the discussion was how much storage you had. When you were using floppy disks, many of the images that I create today and save routinely are bigger than the capacity of any of the floppy disks. One image. And so basically, floppy disks were replaced by other medium. The original hard drives were in the range of gigabytes, not even 2 megabytes. In other words, the big obsession there was with compressing files and doing all sorts of things so that you could save a few images on your computer, and you were constantly worried about your running out of memory. So this was kind of the existing thing for many years. Now that carries over to the present. We still have people obsessing over the size, and we don't want to, oh, they're taking up so much room on my computer. Okay, so this is purchased March 2024. This is a year ago, and right now the price has dropped considerably from what I paid before. And this is a Seagate 20 terabyte external hard drive. All I can say about a terabyte hard drive, even 1 terabyte, is that most of the collections that you're going to encounter, most of the document collections that people have in their basement or the closets or their wherever they've stashed it, probably will never get over a terabyte. And this is a 20 terabyte hard drive. A 20 terabyte hard drive can store roughly 20 million average size documents. Think about that. And if you have 20 million documents, your house is probably non-livable. So I don't think that's even a question. And if you divide that $479, $478.60, divided by 20 million, it's point whatever that is per document. And so the cost of this is beginning to reach zero per document. I mean, it's not zero because there is some slight amount of information. But right now, they're starting to sell 100 terabyte hard drives. That's 100 terabytes. Previously, that was the kind of information they would say you could put the entire Library of Congress on into into so many terabytes of information, like 68 terabytes, and you could digitize the entire collection of the Library of Congress and things like that. But a 100 terabyte drive, even if you worked hard the rest of your life digitizing every single day, you could never fill that drive. Even if you were recording movies and downloading them, you'd get far tireder of doing it before you got to the end of that. If you look at this pile of documents, let's say these records, hopefully this is not sitting in your storage shed, but if it is, then you need to really start thinking about this. Is all of this could be reduced to being put on a single flash drive. If I went in and bought a 2 or 3 terabyte or 5 terabyte flash drive or a 10 terabyte flash drive, I could do this. Now, that would be expensive. The flash drive would cost a few hundreds of dollars if it was that large. But technically, you could do all that on one drive. That's, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that the question of storage is not a question, except in the abstract when you're talking about millions and millions and millions of documents. So if you're Family Search and you've got your huge collection of documents and online digital images, your collection may be way into the higher amounts of information. The next level up, by the way, from a terabyte is a petabyte. And there are petabytes of information out there. But the number of and the content of a file that's as big as a petabyte file is absolutely incredibly large. So the petabyte file a petabyte information or more than 1 petabyte or two or three or five or up to whatever petabytes. For instance, there is a website online right now called archive.org, 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 or the Internet Archive. And yes, they have into the petabytes of information. But even then, if you're in a kind of a commercial, that, that's looking at when you're thinking of 100 terabyte drives, a petabyte of information may be a stack of maybe a block of 100 or so or 200 or so drives when we start to get into that range. Okay, so what I find when I talk to people that the main obstacle is the amount of time and effort needed to do the digitizing. That's my constant limitation. And I'm sure it's the same with everyone else. Everyone has a limited amount of time that they can allocate. And it's particularly difficult if you only have a few documents, but you have to travel to get them digitized, or you have to pay someone to get them digitized. So this is a picture from the BYU Library Family History Center. We have a very large variety of different types of scanners and book scanners and fast and images for images and every other kind of media out there, slides and 8 millimeters film. And there's a very long list, and it's all on the BYU Library Family History Center website. So you go there and look at under preservation and digitizing, and you'll see the long list of the types of equipment we have, which is all free to use during the time the library is open and there's someone there to supervise. And that's all on the website. So you can do three things. You can buy the equipment you need to do. If you have a substantial amount, it's going to take you a long, long time, like in our position where we have, it's always even increasing in the number of things we need to digitize. Then it's convenient for us and makes sense on our time frames to own the equipment. So we bought a book scanner and flatbed scanner, and we have cameras, and we have other things like our phones to do digitizing. But you then can rely on libraries or family search centers. They might have the equipment, maybe, maybe not. Some do, and some don't. But it's possible that a family search center or a library might have the equipment. Or you can hire people to do the scanning. And that's another issue altogether. So we have, and I'm going to say this again, a large selection of equipment that's free to use to digitize all types of original formats. And on Sunday afternoons, when the library is open from 4 until 8, the Family History Library Center is open, then you really have people sort of there. It's just going to have a lot of people there bringing in boxes and rolling suitcases and things with documents in them to get digitized. And it may take, them a few weeks to get it done, or maybe even longer. And I mentioned there are professional companies that will actually digitize boxes of records and photos at a time. So if you have 5 boxes of records, they'll estimate the number of documents, and then they will take your documents, digitize all of them, and organize them and put them on their website, and then you would pay for it. And this is in a sense you're paying for the service that is based on the number of documents that are done. So the more documents you have. In addition, some of these companies like Index here have very, very, very sophisticated, very fast handwriting recognition capabilities. And so you can give them an old journal and they can digitize the whole record for you. That you have to contact them, make arrangements to get the documents to them. They're very helpful in that way. At Roots Tech, which we just finished for 2025, there were probably 6 or 8 different booths of companies that were providing some aspect of digitization services, up to those who were providing organizational and storage capabilities to those who were providing actual physical digitization. So if you go back to RootsTech and look at rootstech.org online and look through the exhibitors, you're going to find a number of companies that have the services. Now, this is kind of, in the essence, the bad news about any kind of preservation effort. Just because you have a piece of paper, you keep it warm and dry, does not mean your house doesn't get destroyed by a tornado. Just because you put it in a digital file, it does not mean that it's preserved. You still have to move that file and put it into some kind of a location where that digital file will be preserved, meaning you have to put it on a website or an archive or someplace that is willing to house that and willing to keep it maintained and transfer it, move it to new different storage methods and keeping it so that the record can actually be accessed. I learned this lesson the hard way. I was writing my own personal journal on an old Mac computer many years ago, and I was using a program called MacWrite, which was one of the very, very few and very first really usable word processing programs. The files that MacWrite made were MacWrite files. Well, time passed, and I had a whole bunch of MacWrite files from the years of my first efforts at journal writing. And all of a sudden, I realized that none of the computers could read those MacWrite files because they were out of date. I made a scramble. We actually found one of our old computers and converted them to what we call text files. And then the text files were able to be read by a new medium, meaning we were able to transfer that information to a newer computer and preserve it. The idea here, it's called migration. So what you're doing is you're moving the documents over a period of time to newer storage devices and making sure they still are readable. And the way to do that today is to make sure that the document is moved periodically. And the time frame here that I would use is about every 5 years. So that's why digital preservation is just another challenge. In other words, we need to focus on it. And if your work is worth doing, it's also worth backing up. And this presentation isn't on forms of backup, but the idea here is to take the computer data, put it into some kind of storage, perhaps on a remote backup service like I use to back up all my hard drives and everything are backed up constantly to the internet, to the company that backs those up, and then protect that. And if necessary, if you lose data, to restore it. And I'm surprised at how many people who have their computers use the main storage on their computer and do not have a backup of all your information to an external hard drive. You know, you're just asking for trouble. But there's two programs, one on the Apple and on the PC, and that's Apple Time Machine and Windows File History. Both require an external hard drive, but they automatically back up files. And Time Machine is extremely useful because if you happen to lose a file for some reason, you can simply go to the Time Machine and go back a few days or hours or days or whatever and get the original document and restore it. You usually need to pay for online storage. That's just a statement. You can shop around and make the best deal you can, but deals are not always as good. It's better to have somebody that has some longevity and pay slightly more than it is to do otherwise. So what's the cost? There is a cost. And like I said, it's a matter of time. The cost of preserving pieces of information is extremely small for small collections. The cost for larger collections has been dropping over the years per item. And so what is the real cost? It's the cost of losing all your valuable documents and memories. That's what we're up against. So you want to lose everything. You've got all your photographs of all your children and everything. We hear about the storms and floods and tornadoes and such across the United States here. And how many of those people had documents in their houses that are now gone? How many of them did not have a way to preserve those documents outside of what was sitting in their house? So those are the questions you want to think about. And you may think, well, nothing's ever going to happen on my street, but I'll tell you right now that it will. So here we're getting into something a little bit extra. This is the actual storage for documents, and this is a what we would call a server farm. This is the physical place where all these various huge companies store, like Amazon and Google and other companies that do storage, huge storage amounts. The other thing we're concerned with is file format. And then we're talking about migration, which means moving the documents to newer programs and to newer ways so that you're preserving the information over time. And then the venue means where they're actually being stored. So these are the four categories. Now, if you say your physical equipment's your computer, your file format is the one you're using, like a Word document, for example. Your migration would be to make sure that Word documents can be opened over time. And the venue means where they're actually being physically located. And if it's in the same place as your physical equipment, you're probably running a problem because your physical equipment gets destroyed, your information gets destroyed. If you have it in a different venue or place, then when your physical equipment is destroyed, your information is not lost. And this is just for information's sake. Desktop computers are good for about 5 to 8 years. Now, I know people have older computers. They are really on the edge of losing all their information. They have better have good backups because they are not going to be able to keep that information for many more years on their computer. It's less on laptops, high-end workstations. When we're talking about that, we're talking about spending anything over $5,000 on a system and the professional level systems. Hard disk drives, same time frame, only less, 3 to 5 years. After 5 years on a hard drive, you better replace it, whether it's acting up or not. The time limit for that drive is running and it will fail. Enterprise hard drives are just expensive hard drives. They're more, let's say they're just more expensive and they do a better job, but they don't get you any very much more years. They're still at the 5 year range. SSDs, that's flash drives, thumb drives, whatever you want to call them, SSD disks, chips, all those things. They might last 10 years. I wouldn't keep them that long. I would be migrating that information well before 10 years. Enterprise CDs, it's even less. SSDs is even less. So you just do regular backups, regardless of the storage technology. The key to this is computers and all their accessories are consumables. They're not an investment. You don't invest in a computer. You buy it like you do bread, ice cream, or donuts. They're consumables. And that means in 5 years, you have consumed that machine's usefulness. That's the answer. And therefore, you are skating on thin ice after 5 years, very thin ice. The time factor doesn't have anything to do with the physical damage or loss. So if you put it on a thumb drive and you leave it in the library or you drop it or you run over it with your car or you burn it in your on your barbecue, you're lost. It doesn't matter if it's brand new. So new flash drives have the ability to get lost just as old flash drives. And I cannot tell you how many times I have left my flash drives and had to run back to the library to retrieve them. So keep learning. There's always more. There's always more information. And thanks for watching. First question comes up, says, if I buy a terabyte flash drive, it needs to be replaced every 5 years. Yep, that's exactly what I'm saying. Every 5 years from now, it'll be cheaper, it'll be bigger. But if you're 5 or 6 or 7 years old, the figures I gave you are a compilation summary of people all across the internet giving their opinion and all of the tests that are being made constantly. And I'm watching the tests and I'm seeing how fast the server farm people replace their hard drives. And for a 5-year-old hard drive, they're basically saying it's not worth keeping. But yes, the answer to the question is terabyte drive needs to be replaced every few years. It's a consumable. You've consumed its value. It may still keep working, but every year you go beyond 5 years raises the percentage of possibility that the flash drive will stop receiving and sending information. Flash drives actually degrade over time.